Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 159 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the third week of March 2025. In today's podcast, so Americans confident that they can push their agenda during the negotiations with Russia in Saudi Arabia. And we're also going to talk about why Trump wants a Ukrainian nuclear power plant. So the Americans assume that these meetings in Saudi Arabia are very important for identifying issues where it's possible to move forward, where it is actually difficult. The Americans understand that all these strikes that are taking place now are politically and medially saying that any partial ceasefire will not hold. That is, the ceasefire cannot be half-hearted. This was clear from the very beginning to the Americans and to others. And they will now use what is happening, both the strikes at night, which we all see, and the Russian attacks, in particular on the Odessa region, but not only, simply formulating if there are attacks, no one controls them. Then either a complete cessation and as soon as possible, or it doesn't work. This is not a simple logic for us, it is a challenge. You see what is happening after the call between Trump and Putin. Putin is trying to hammer in his nails and hang books on the agenda that is critical to him, and which doesn't concern the ceasefire, but is simply another one, a list of Russia's goals in this war. And these goals, in fact, are the limitation of our sovereignty and the limitation of Ukrainian ability to engage in any defense and any cooperation, whether security or otherwise, with the West. Therefore, the negotiations in Saudi Arabia will be exhaustingly difficult, perhaps also super emotional. But the Americans, at least that's how we see that, are almost sure that they will be able to push through their logic. And without the Americans, this logic absolutely doesn't work. Seems that Americans simply trying to accomplish. First, the Americans want a ceasefire, which is possible only with them and only at their expense, and as soon as possible. Perhaps somewhere around Easter. Later, earlier, it's not longer critical. They want a victory, Trump personally and their own. They want to show that they can achieve this victory and only with them it can hold. Second, they want to start a separate process of normalizing relations with Russia beyond what is being discussed regarding Ukraine. And these are a lot of issues, such as global politics, regional security, the distribution of energy markets, and other issues. And it is very important that they cannot normalize such relations without advancing on our agenda, and we understand that. We're now critically interested in ensuring that these issues are not divided by the Americans. So the US also understand if they do not achieve any progress toward resolving war in Ukraine, they are immediately accused of being weak. They have not advanced at least a compromise agenda. And the third, logic of the Americans is very simple. They want to say, yes, we will reach this agreement, or better say, a deal, and then the Europeans, the financing of Ukraine, and all other issues. We control certain assets there. We have some of it. The Chinese do not get access. No one else. It is supposedly in our own interest. But then the issue of Ukraine is an issue of the Europeans. So, what is Putin doing actually today? He understands perfectly well that he will not be able to break through all his desires, and he's playing with time and content. He's stalling for time, thus trying to cram more and more of his issues into the agenda regarding the limitation of Ukraine's sovereignty as part of the further negotiations path, so that no one can refuse them later. That is, He wants to ceasefire to be unconditional. He wants to tie these conditions and the need to work on them at least to the fact of the ceasefire. Also, he will carefully and very gradually put forward these desires. He understands that if he immediately tells everyone what he wants again, everyone will say no, no one will ever accept this. But he will carefully put forward first, but let's talk about this. Let's make a list of issues that are critical. Are we doing here? What are we actually trying to achieve? Americans, do you want a ceasefire sooner? So you better to agree to what we propose. So let's put all these issues as necessary. Let's record it. Let's sign it. These kind of hooks will now be set in the negotiations every 10 minutes. And this is what is happening. Do you actually see what Putin's doing now? He is clearing the occupied territories. A few days ago, a decision was made in Russia. If you do not have Russian documents, you are not a person there at all. And we're speaking about the occupied territories. That is, in fact, the clearing is going quite consciously. And Putin deliberately issued this decision before the negotiations to say, yes, there will be nothing in the sense of possible negotiations about the some territories. That is, you will not return anything, and I do not owe you anything. This is the meaning of his political signal. What does Putin get? Unfortunately, in this model, he gets the opportunity to treat the occupied territories as they were Russian, although not in a political or legal sense, but in the sense of how they function as almost attached to the Russian political, legal, economic, and social space. Once upon a time, people in Tallinn, Vilnius, Riga were not limited in their contacts with the outside world. They could be cultural, economic, or other events there. That is, Putin understands perfectly well that he will not be able to legally recognize all these, although he will try and bargain to the last. But he wants to legitimize, not in a legal sense, his elements of control over the occupied territories. And at some point, present this and say, present this and say, you see, this is a fact, this is a fate accomplished. And if this is a fate accomplished and Russia controls it, then let's continue to live with it. And at some point, I will try to arrange something to get legal or political recognition. So, therefore, the price of what is happening is precisely the legitimization of the occupied territories is the Russian space, in the Russian space. And among these issues that are critical in the status of the occupied territories, this element of deterrence is what is important for our security. Not security guarantees, because any presence on our territory is not a guarantee, but deterrence of further Russian aggression. Putin's decree on the deadline of September 10 is precisely the political signal. I will not exchange anything regarding the territories. And secondly, everyone who wants to live in these territories must become, if not in their heads, then from the point of view of documents, from the point of view of their understanding, or in the legal Russian space, a Russian. That is, become part of the Russian legal field. He wants to occupy not only territories but also people. This is a very important understanding of what he is doing now. So, Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, suggested that the US position on the occupied territories of Ukraine could be the same as the position of the West on the Soviet occupation of the Baltic countries. This means that an American can come to the occupied Crimea for a vacation, just an example, can start a business there and buy a hotel or do other things. He can perform there with some kind of performance and whatever he wants to do. That is, it will be a space of normal relations, but strictly legally, it will not be recognized as Russian. But At the same time, no one will be prevented from communicating, developing business in this territory, communicating with the Russian occupied authorities. That is, it will not be something that will be punished in the West or in the non West. It will be an absolutely normal story, with the exception of the legal and political logic that this is actually Ukrainian territory. But for everything that will happen there will be no punishment, neither criminal nor administrative, in fact. This is not just the abolition of all sanctions against the occupied territories, this is actually their legalization. This is not the legal normalization, but I would call it the word legalization as a legalization of American Russian contacts and is currently taking place. As this is not simple logic. And I think that Putin will hammer nails into the logic. The question is really what the status of the presence of Ukrainian occupied by Russian territory will be. Will this territory a Security Council resolution? Will this territory require a Security Council resolution? And then both Russia and China will dictate the conditions for such a deployment. Or will the Europeans say, no, there will be perhaps some UN part of UN dimension, but there will also be ours, and we would not ask Russia about the fact that we are on the territory of Ukraine. But the main thing is what we cooperate with Ukraine, because Putin wants to limit any security cooperation with the West. He says no weapons, no training, no logistics, nothing. The Ukrainians do whatever they want, and this logic is fundamental for me. And the Europeans should say no matter what happens in these negotiations in Saudi Arabia, whatever they say, we will continue to security cooperation with Ukraine in the way we consider it necessary, because Ukrainian security is part of European security. And Ukraine, in this sense, is an element of our defense against what can come from both the East and the South. Then, that is the fundamental thing that the Europeans have to say. Whatever happens, the Europeans still reserve the right and the understanding that they will continue security cooperation as we agree with them. And no one fundamentally influences this cooperation, because the Americans, in the context of talks with Russia, can agree on what they will supply, what they will not supply, what they will do or not do. They will not completely limit it, but partially. This is an absolutely real story. So, why Trump wants to take control of Ukraine nuclear power plants? Trump's desire to take control of Ukraine nuclear power plants, oddly enough, could have arisen after talking with Putin. The fact is that depriving nuclear technologies and processes in the policy of nuclear countries toward the rest of the world. Ukraine remained with nuclear power plants only because it was impossible to take them from Ukraine, like warheads and even non nuclear cruise missiles. This is the only reason why the club of nuclear powers allowed Ukraine to remain a country with nuclear generation. At that time, the transformation of Ukraine into a banana republic with several thermal power plants was physically impossible. Ukraine continued to generate nuclear energy, but under the close supervision of the IAEA, International Atomic Organization, that controls all the power plants or power facilities globally. In terms of the rapid occupation of Ukraine after the start of the invasion, Ukrainian nuclear power plants were among the main goals of the occupiers, and the Russians managed to capture the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the largest station on the continent, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. That is, the Russians have not achieved their 100% goal. But in the concept of nuclear states, it is quite likely that Ukraine should be deprived of nuclear technologies. So, it is possible that Trump is playing the same game with Putin, and the complete denuclearization of Ukraine is on the agenda. This may also be important because Moscow fears that if Russian troops advance deep into the territory of Ukraine, the Ukrainians might blow up operating nuclear power plants. Russian propagandists in Russia and pro Russian supporters from Ukraine have written and spoken about this numerous times. And if enemies and propagandists are talking about this, then the course of disinformation and political activity is in the Kremlin. In addition, the Russians have launched a simply historical campaign about a dirty nuclear bomb from Ukraine, and Russian special services have shot a video with the pilot of a light engine aircraft who was captured. The video talked about the preparation of a dirty bomb from Ukraine. It is obvious that a person who is in the captivity can say what they are told. Not everyone can resist the method of physical and psychological influence of FSB. The very fact that this video has been distributed among Russians and concerned about the alleged access of Ukrainians to radioactive materials. Moscow seeks to stop such access, although Russian nuclear scientists understand perfectly well that all the Ukrainian nuclear materials at nuclear power plants are under the strict control of International Atomic Organization. As, academic Anatoly Nosovsky, director of Institute of Nuclear Power Plant Safety Problems, said that the International Atomic Organization is stuffed with Russian citizens. The deputy director general of this organization is also Russian, and all nuclear materials in Ukraine are under their very strict control, sealed, and done under constant video surveillance. In addition, nuclear materials have their own specific signature by which experts will quickly determine their origin and even record an attempt to move them. But even under such conditions, the Russians are trying to completely cut off Ukraine from components that, at least theoretically, can be used in the production of any type of nuclear weapon. That is, even having a nuclear power plant on their territory, the Ukrainians do not have the physical ability to do anything with radioactive materials, bypassing protocols and agreements with their Western partners. But even despite this, it is possible that Washington will build new rules in the field of nuclear cooperation with Ukraine, also taking into account the fact that the system of control and financing under the auspices of USA aid was actually destroyed by the Trump's administration, together with this organization, which managed the process by allocating special grants. Yes, nuclear power plants control cannot be taken out of Ukraine, but as it turned out, they can be taken under control and deprive Ukraine of part of its sovereignty in the energy sector. In light of the statements we hear from Washington, we cannot rule out that the US desire to take control of the Ukraine nuclear power plants is not a policy agreed with Moscow. We do not know all the details of Trump's telephone conversation with Putin. After all, no matter how the situation in Ukraine develops, the Americans will control this sector, the security sector. But we can say for sure that the pressure on Ukraine and this nuclear industry will grow. After all, the US has serious leverage over this process in the form of Westinghouse fuel used at Ukrainian nuclear power plants. So Russia trying to get the control of Ukraine, to get the control of Ukraine energy sources, territories, but Ukraine is still resist. Ukraine still needs a strong allies like United States and Ukraine and European Union to protect our sovereignty. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.